You control the mind, but you still can't overcome fear. Have you ever sat down to pray, closed your eyes, and tried with everything inside you to push fear away, only to feel it pushing back even harder than before? Have you ever stood in church, lifted your hands in worship, felt the presence of God in that place, and then walked out into the parking lot only to find the fear waiting for you right there beside your car, just as heavy as it was when you walked in? Have you ever spent months memorizing scriptures about peace, about trust, about the sovereignty of God, and still found yourself lying awake at 2 in the morning with your heart pounding over something you have already prayed about 100 times? Have you ever tried breathing techniques, journaling, positive declarations, renewing your mind with the Word, and done all of it consistently, faithfully, sincerely, and still woken up the next morning with that same familiar weight sitting on your chest before your feet even hit the floor? Have you ever gotten to a point where you started to wonder quietly and almost guiltily whether the peace that Jesus promised is something that only works for other people, whether you are somehow the exception to a promise that seems to work for everyone else? If you have been there, and I believe most people watching this right now have been there at some point, I want you to hear something clearly before we go any further. You are not broken. You are not faithless. And God has not abandoned you in this. But there is something that nobody has told you yet. Something that most sincere Bible-believing Christians spend years, sometimes entire decades, trying to figure out on their own, circling the same mountain over and over again without understanding why the victory never seems to last. And what I want to share with you today is the thing that changes everything. Not a new technique, not a more disciplined approach to mental management, something deeper, something that goes to the actual root of where fear lives and does not just trim the branches but pulls the whole thing out from the ground. The truth that most of us were never taught is this: controlling your mind is not the same thing as healing your heart. Those two things are not the same battlefield. The mental tools are real. Scripture memory is real. Declarations are real. The discipline of taking every thought captive is real, and it is biblical, and it matters. But all of those tools operate at the level of the mind, and fear does not ultimately live in the mind. Fear lives in the spirit. It lives in that deep interior place of the soul where your relationship with God either flourishes or withers, where intimacy with the Holy Spirit either grows or starves, where trust in God either becomes rooted and permanent or remains shallow and seasonal. And until you treat fear as the spiritual condition it actually is, you will keep winning small battles in your mind and losing the larger war in your heart. You will keep experiencing temporary relief and wondering why the peace never stays. You will keep fighting with everything you have and still feel like you are running on empty. David Wilkerson spent decades preaching about this very thing, and it was one of the central burdens of his entire ministry. In his messages, he would return again and again to the condition of the modern Christian's interior life, warning with urgency and with love about the way that sincere, church-going believers had slowly allowed their inner communion with God to grow thin and hollow, not through rebellion or deliberate sin, but through busyness, distraction, and the gradual substitution of religious activity for genuine spiritual intimacy. He would speak about the soul that reads its Bible every morning as a duty, that prays its prayers as a checklist, going through all the right motions while the living flame of personal encounter with Jesus has grown dim and cool. And he would say that a soul in that condition, however sincere, is a soul that will live in fear, because fear is simply what happens when a heart that was made for the living presence of God begins to experience its absence. The Bible speaks directly to this in 1 John 4:18, where it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love." That verse is not describing a theological abstraction. It is describing an experiential reality that is available to every believer willing to go to the place where it can be received. Perfect love is not a concept you understand. It is a presence you inhabit. It is the living, personal, transforming nearness of God himself, the God who is love, the God whose very nature is the antidote to every fear that has ever gripped a human heart. And the promise is not that perfect love will come to you automatically because you believe the right things. The promise is that perfect love casts out fear when you are being perfected in it, when you are actively, daily deepening your life inside that love, when you are not just visiting the presence of God in moments of crisis, but making his presence the atmosphere you breathe every hour of every day. I want to walk with you today through 4 signs that the fear you are dealing with is not primarily a mental problem, but a spiritual one. And with each sign, I also want to show you the specific door that God is holding open for you right now, because this is not a message that ends in condemnation or discouragement. This is a message that ends in invitation and in hope. The God who sees exactly where you are today is not disappointed in you. He is reaching toward you. He is calling you deeper. And every one of these signs, when you recognize it honestly, is not a verdict on your spiritual life. It is a compass pointing you toward the life that Jesus died to give you. The first sign that your fear is a spiritual problem and not just a mental one is this: your fear keeps coming back even after you defeat it. You go through a difficult season. You pray your way through it. You reach a point of peace. You feel genuine relief. You tell others that God came through and it is all true and real. But then a new fear rises, or the same old fear returns in a slightly different form, and you fight that one too, and you win again, and it comes back again, and this cycle, this exhausting, demoralizing cycle of temporary victory followed by inevitable return, begins to feel like a life sentence. You start to wonder whether real, lasting freedom from fear is simply not available to you in this lifetime. You start to wonder whether Paul meant something less literal when he wrote about the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. You start to quietly lower your expectations for what the Christian life can actually feel like from the inside. But that cycle of returning fear is not a sign that you are spiritually inferior. It is a sign that the source of the fear has not been addressed. It has only been temporarily silenced. And Jesus actually described this pattern in Matthew 12:43 through 45, when he spoke of an unclean spirit that leaves a person, travels through waterless places seeking rest, finds none, and returns to the house it came from. And when it arrives, it finds the house swept clean and put in order, but empty. And so it goes, and brings with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and the final condition of that person is worse than the first. Now, I want to be careful here and say clearly that I am not using this passage to suggest that fear in your life is evidence of demonic occupation. But Jesus was teaching a principle about what happens when something is removed without being replaced, when a life is cleaned up without being filled up. An empty house is an invitation, and the interior life that has been disciplined and swept clean through mental effort but has not been filled with the living, active, daily presence of the Holy Spirit will always be vulnerable to the return of what was driven out, because the enemy does not respect willpower. He respects occupancy. He retreats when the house is full of God. David Wilkerson would often speak about this in his preaching. He would describe the sincere believer who was working harder and harder at the spiritual life, trying more techniques, reading more books, attending more services, and yet growing more weary and more afraid rather than more free. And he would say with pastoral directness that what that person needed was not more effort, but more encounter. Not better strategies for managing their inner world, but a genuine, personal, desperate return to the presence of Jesus. Not the Jesus of theology or doctrine or church programs, but the living Jesus who walks with us, who fills us, who is himself the peace that the world cannot give and that fear cannot survive. Here is the practical application for this first sign, and I want you to take it seriously, because it is simple enough to dismiss and important enough to change everything. Today, before this day ends, find 15 minutes where you will not be interrupted, and go to that place not to study, not to journal, not to make a prayer list, but simply to be still before God and acknowledge that you need His presence more than you need His answers. Tell Him you are tired of fighting this alone. Tell Him that the techniques are not enough. Tell Him you want the real thing, not just the relief, but the presence. And sit there long enough for the noise of your own thinking to begin to quiet, even if nothing dramatic happens. The point is not the experience you feel. The point is the direction of your soul. Turn toward Him. Stay turned and do that again tomorrow. The second sign that fear is a spiritual condition and not just a mental one is this: your fear intensifies in the very moments when you are most spiritually active. This surprises people because the logic seems backwards. You would expect that the times when you are praying the most, reading the Word the most, seeking God the hardest, would be the times when fear has the least power over you. But many sincere believers experience the opposite. They go into a season of deeper prayer and the anxiety spikes. They begin a fast and the dread gets louder. They feel a genuine stirring to draw closer to God, and within days they are more tormented by fear than they were before they started. And the natural conclusion is that they are doing something wrong, or that God is not responding, or that spiritual pursuit simply does not work for them the way it works for other people. But that intensification is not random, and it is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of warfare. And warfare means movement. It means something is happening. The Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 1:7 that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Notice that Paul describes fear as a spirit, not merely a feeling or a cognitive pattern, but something that comes from outside and seeks to operate within the person. And the purpose of that spirit of fear, when it intensifies during seasons of spiritual seeking, is always the same: to stop the seeker before the breakthrough comes, to make the cost of pressing in feel higher than the value of what lies on the other side, to convince the believer that the effort is not worth it, that God is not responding, and that the wisest thing to do is to pull back to the familiar mediocrity of a life lived at a safer spiritual distance. Think about the pattern in your own experience. Have you ever begun a committed season of prayer over something significant in your life? A health crisis, a broken relationship, a financial pressure, a decision that needed God's direction, and found that the first few days were the hardest, most fear-filled days of the entire crisis? The circumstances had not changed. In fact, you were doing the most spiritually powerful thing available to you. But the fear was at its most intense. That is not coincidence. David Wilkerson understood this deeply, and he would speak about what he called the testing of the pursuit. He would tell believers that the enemy always fights hardest at the doorway to breakthrough, and that the soul that learns to read intensified fear as confirmation that it is moving in the right direction will cross thresholds that most believers never reach. Because most people turn back right before the breakthrough. They interpret the increase in resistance as evidence that the door is closed, when in fact the increase in resistance is evidence that the door is about to open. The practical application here requires a shift in interpretation that is simple to understand but takes real practice to apply. I want to invite you to change the way you read the experience of fear rising during your times of prayer and spiritual seeking. Instead of reading it as a sign that you should stop, start reading it as confirmation that you are exactly where you need to be. When fear rises during your quiet time, do not shut the Bible and walk away. Lean in, stay longer. Say out loud, Lord, I see what is happening. I am not moving. I am staying here until your presence is more real to me than this fear. And then stay. Your body will want to leave. Your mind will manufacture 100 reasons why you should do something more productive with your time. Stay anyway. Because the peace that comes to the person who refuses to let fear drive them away from God's presence is a peace that nothing in your circumstances can manufacture, and nothing in your circumstances can take away. There is a third sign that fear is a spiritual condition, and this one is perhaps the most common experience among mature believers. It is this: you experience genuine peace in God's presence, but you cannot seem to carry it into your daily life. There are moments, and you know these moments, when the peace of God becomes almost tangible to you. In a worship service, when the presence of God fills the room in an unmistakable way, in a rare morning of prayer that goes unexpectedly deep, in a moment of scripture reading, when a verse seems to come off the page and land directly in the middle of a fear you have been carrying. In those moments, the fear goes quiet. It does not just diminish, it goes completely silent. And you feel what the Bible describes, a peace that surpasses understanding, a rest that goes all the way down to the bottom of you. And in that moment, you think, this is it. This is what I have been searching for. Now I can carry this with me. But then you walk back into your life. The emails are waiting, the phone is buzzing, the family member calls with a crisis. It is the operative condition of the entire promise. God does not offer the straightened path to the partially surrendered heart. He offers it to the all-in heart. Not the perfect heart, but the surrendered one. The heart that says, Lord, I do not understand this. I cannot control this. I do not know how this ends. But I give it to you completely, and I choose to trust you with it, even though trusting you feels like stepping off a ledge in the dark. That is the prayer that unlocks the peace, because it is the alignment of the human will with the divine invitation. And God's peace floods into the soul the moment that alignment happens. Think about the specific fear you carry most consistently, the one that comes back regardless of how many times you pray it through, the one that lives in your stomach like a stone, the one that wakes you up at 3 in the morning, even in seasons when everything is going relatively well. Now, ask yourself honestly, is there something in that area that you have been trying to manage on your own rather than releasing to God? Is there an outcome you are terrified of that you have been trying to prevent through worry and control and overplanning? Is there a person you love whose future you have been gripping so tightly that your hands are white with the effort of it? Is there a version of your own future that you are so afraid of that you have been secretly asking God for His peace, while privately telling yourself that you will trust Him only if He guarantees the outcome you can accept? David Wilkerson would speak about this with a tenderness and a directness that very few preachers have matched. He would describe what he called the altar of full surrender, the place in the spiritual life where a believer finally stops bringing God the things that feel safe to give and starts bringing Him everything, including the things that feel most dangerous to release. He would say that the journey to that altar is the hardest journey a Christian can make, because the things we hold back are always the things we love the most or fear the most. But he would also say, with the conviction of someone who had walked that road himself, that the moment of release is always followed by a peace so profound and so complete that the believer wonders, with a mixture of grief and relief, why it took so long to get there. He would remind his listeners that the things we hold back from God for safekeeping do not actually become safer in our hands. They become more vulnerable because our hands are limited and our strength gives out. But in God's hands, nothing is ever truly at risk in the way that matters most, not in the eternal sense, not in the sense of what God is faithfully working toward in the life of every soul He loves. The practical application for this fourth sign requires honesty and courage. I want you to take a sheet of paper or open a note on your phone and write down specifically and honestly the thing or things you are most afraid of. Not a general category like health or finances or relationships, the specific thing, the specific person, the specific outcome. Give it a name, put it on paper, and then next to each one, write these words: Lord, I release this to you. I take my hands off this. I trust you with this completely, even if the outcome is not what I would choose, even if I never understand why. I choose to trust you because you are good and because you love me and because your ways are higher than mine. And then sign your name at the bottom, not as a contract, but as a declaration, a concrete physical act that your body and your soul can feel. Because there is something in the act of writing it down, of naming it, of signing your name that makes the surrender real in a way that a silent mental agreement rarely does. And if tomorrow the fear returns for that same thing, do not be discouraged. Return to the paper, read what you wrote, say it again. Because surrender is not always a single moment. Sometimes it is a daily practice, a daily choosing of trust over control. And every time you make that choice, the roots of fear go a little deeper out of the soil of your heart. Now let me walk back through what we have covered today, because I want these 4 signs to be clear and settled in your heart before we finish. The first sign is that your fear keeps coming back even after you defeat it. That cycle is telling you the source of the fear has not been addressed, only temporarily silenced. The house that was swept clean was left empty, and an empty house is vulnerable. The remedy is not more mental effort, but more genuine daily communion with God, returning to the presence, filling the house. The second sign is that your fear gets louder during your most spiritually active seasons. That intensification is not a sign of failure or of God's absence. It is the enemy responding to the threat of breakthrough, and the correct response is always to press in harder, to stay at the place of prayer and seeking until the presence becomes stronger than the fear. The third sign is that you experience God's peace in special moments, but cannot carry it through your ordinary day. The remedy is the practice of presence, the continuous daily habit of returning your awareness to the fact that God is with you right now, not just during devotional time, but in the traffic and the waiting room and the difficult conversation and the quiet house at midnight. And the fourth and deepest sign is that there is something you have not fully surrendered, an area of withheld control, and that held back place is exactly where fear lives. The remedy is the altar. The remedy is release. The remedy is the daily, specific, named and declared act of placing the most frightening things in the hands of the most faithful God. I want you to picture what your life looks like on the other side of this. Not a perfect life, not a life without uncertainty or loss or seasons of waiting in the dark, but a life in which fear no longer has the final word, a life in which you wake up in the morning and your first instinct is not to calculate what could go wrong today, but to turn toward the one who is already present with you in this moment. A life in which the hard things still come, because they will, but they find you anchored in something that circumstances cannot move. A life in which the peace of God is not something you chase on Sunday and lose by Monday, but something you carry with you into every room and every conversation. That life is not reserved for a special category of Christian. That is the life that Jesus described when he said he came to give life more abundantly. That is the inheritance of every believer who is willing to go to the place where it is received. You are going to stop trying to manage fear with mental techniques and start treating it as the spiritual condition it is. You are going to stop treating your time with God as an obligation and start treating it as the most essential encounter of your life, the place where the soul is refueled and fear is deprived of the oxygen it needs to survive. You are going to stop carrying in your own hands the things that were only ever meant to be held in God's hands. You are going to stop interpreting the intensification of fear during prayer as a reason to pull back and start recognizing it as a signal to press in. You are going to stop living as a visitor in the presence of God and start building your daily life around the awareness that He is always present with you. And you're going to go to the altar and place the specific, named, honest fears of your heart into the hands of the God who has never let go of anything He has promised to hold. I want to invite you to write something in the comments right now. Write the words, "I choose to trust you completely," or something in your own words that says the same thing, a declaration that you are done managing fear alone, a declaration that you are choosing surrender over control and presence over performance. There is something real and significant about a public declaration of faith. David Wilkerson believed this deeply. He understood that the moment a soul puts words to its decision, something shifts in the spiritual atmosphere around that person, not because the words carry magic power, but because the act of declaration is itself a step of faith, and faith is always the doorway through which the power of God walks in. So write it. Let it stand in the record of this day as the moment something changed. If this message has spoken to something that has been sitting in your heart for a long time, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video right now. This channel exists to bring the kind of deep, serious, Spirit-filled teaching that David Wilkerson gave his life to. The kind of message that does not just inform the mind, but pierces the heart and calls the soul to movement. Every message we bring here is built on that foundation, that legacy of urgency and love and uncompromising commitment to a deeper, more surrendered walk with God. If that is what you're hungry for, then this is the place for you. Subscribe, turn on the notifications, and come back for every message, because there is more coming and it will go deeper. You have come too far to stop now. You have carried this long enough. The God who saved you did not save you to a life of managed anxiety and temporary victories over recurring fear. He saved you to a life of fullness, a life rooted in love, a life in which the peace that passes understanding is not an occasional visitor, but a permanent resident. That life is available to you today, in this moment. The door is open, the altar is ready, and the God who has been reaching toward you through this entire message is still reaching now. Go to Him. Give Him all of it, and discover for yourself what it feels like to be held by a love so perfect and so complete that every fear you have ever known has no choice but to bow before it. That is the life He has promised. That is the life He has paid for. And that is the life He is offering you right now. Amen.